You are listening to episode 56 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Kevin Griffin speaks with us about his book, A Burning Desire, Dharma God and the Path of Recovery. Hi everyone, thanks for being here. We've had guests on the podcast before who've spoken about how Buddhist teachings and practice have impacted addiction recovery programs, and often the subject of the classic 12-step program comes up. Many secularists, Buddhists, and atheists have problems with certain steps, specifically those about higher powers and specifically God. Kevin Griffin is the author of One Breath at a Time, Buddhism and the 12 Steps, and A Burning Desire, Dharma God and the Path of Recovery. A longtime Buddhist practitioner and 12-step participant, he is a leader in the mindful recovery movement and one of the founders of the Buddhist Recovery Network. Kevin has trained with leading Western Vipassana teachers, among them Jack Kornfield, Joe Goldstein, and Ajahn Amaro. His teacher training was as a community Dharma leader at Spirit Rock Meditation Center in Marin County, California. Kevin teaches internationally in Buddhist centers, treatment centers, professional conferences, and academic settings. He specializes in helping people in recovery connect with meditation and a progressive understanding of the 12 steps. His events range from evening classes to day-long workshops to long weekend silent retreats. So sit back, relax, and have a nice clouds and mist organic green tea. I've got links to it on the website. Our guest today is author Kevin Griffin. Kevin wrote the books One Breath at a Time, Buddhism and the 12 Steps, and his more recent book, A Burning Desire, Dharma God and the Path of Recovery. Kevin, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Ted.
I'm very glad to speak with you because we had had in a previous episode, we had spoken with Paul Santillan of the Buddhist Recovery Network, and found out some good works there. And he really encouraged me to reach out to you because you have really, quite literally, written the book on what Buddhist 12-step recovery is all about. So what I'd like to do is start by asking you what your first encounters with Buddhism were as a Westerner growing up.
Well, my first real encounter with Buddhism came after I was actually practicing meditation. I started practicing TM, Transcendental Meditation, in 1978. And a couple of years, I guess, no, it was fairly soon after that I met someone who was, I met a woman who was into Zen and Buddhism, and through her I started to become interested in Buddhism, but it took a couple of years before I made the switch to Buddhist practice. TM was so kind of convenient, and but I think the thing that inspired me, the really motivating encounter was Joseph Goldstein's book, The Experience of Insight. When I read that, I just was so inspired, and it made so much sense. It wasn't metaphysical or theoretical or religious. It just was. It was like this is explains a lot about life and about my life. And so then I started taking a class at the International Buddhist Meditation Center in Los Angeles in the Wilshire district. That was the fall of 1980. And there was a monk there who had just come back from Sri Lanka. He was an American who was a Theravadan monk. And so he was teaching kind of the same thing that Joseph Goldstein taught. In fact, I think he had just been to Insight Meditation Society before he arrived there. So I took a class with him, and then he, made me go on a retreat, which I didn't want to do.
Made you go on a retreat.
I was scared. Again, by that time I was involved with this woman, and she had already been on a retreat, and sort of the two of them ganged up on me. And, kind of shamed me into going on a retreat. I was really scared, afraid of going into the silence. And also, every time I meditated for more than a few minutes, my knees would start to really burn, and I was really afraid that would be, really difficult on a retreat.
As it often is, extremely difficult.
As it was. It turned out to be very difficult, but actually working with knee pain wound up being really an entryway in many ways into concentration and insight. So the Buddha uses suffering as the doorway into freedom, and that was one of the many forms of suffering that helped to transform my practice.
And as you're working on concentration on samatha, it really does help sometimes having that kind of focus, because it's something which it's going to be jumping up and down, getting your attention anyway. So putting your mind on that really helps you focus and rest your mind in one spot.
Yeah, and as I often tell people, the breath is so ephemeral. It's very hard to feel the breath a lot of the time. But when your knees are just screaming at you, that really gets your attention. And then I've found that if I'm able to let go of the aversion around it and just relax into the sensation, then that the pain then subsides somewhat, and the sense of it as pain subsides, and it becomes more of just intense sensation. And whenever my mind wanders, the sensation kicks right back, and it sort of works as a mindfulness bell. So that's kind of how I try to teach people to work with that.
Yeah. And you said it beautifully. That was mainly because I was thinking the same word, ephemeral, with the breath, that it really does, as you hit into deeper states of meditation, it is easy to lose the breath. And in fact, that's part of the stages of meditation, is losing the breath and just experiencing mind's awareness. If you're at a point where, though, you want to stay concentrated and more aware, having things like knee pain or hip pain or some sort of distraction like that, it can actually be helpful in the practice.
Yeah, and it's not something you use as a marketing device.
Right.
But,
right.
Once people are roped in, you can let them know the bad news.
Yeah. Yeah, we wouldn't get a lot of people going on a retreat saying, feel your pain more intensely than ever before.
Really.
So, Kevin, help me understand kind of the chronology of how this went for you. Which came first, your work with Buddhism and meditation, or issues with addiction and recovery that led you to writing the book? How did those intersect?
Well, I started meditating long before I got sober, and I got sober in 1985, so that was 7 years I was practicing before I got sober. And as I kind of talk about probably in both my books to some extent, part of my interest in meditation was in kind of finding some kind of a magical fix to the things that I perceived as my problems, and maybe even kind of wanting to get like a free high, instead of having to get stoned every day. And so although there was a sincere interest and desire for spiritual and personal growth, there was also some part of my practice and my motivation that was really driven by delusion, really, about what practice was about, and that I was going to have this enlightenment experience, and then everything was going to be okay in my life. So I practiced, and really, it's maybe that whole 7 years is, we don't have time to talk about the entire time, but just to say that once I started practicing, once I went on that first retreat, I got very intensely into meditation, and within a year I had gone on a 3-month retreat, and kind of chasing this dream of enlightenment. Maybe enlightenment's not a dream, but my version of it was definitely a dream. And once the 3-month retreat was done, and I hadn't, gotten what I wanted, my eye started to wander to other potential avenues to enlightenment, and wound up joining this homeless, anonymous guru, whose name I still don't know. And traveling with him because he promised I'd become enlightened in 6 months if I just, lived on faith with him. And he didn't have a home, and he would just travel around and get people to leave their homes and sort of support him with whatever, people would kind of sell their belongings and join him and kind of support him. But he wasn't somebody who was trying to make money, because he didn't really have money. So it was a very strange, one of those kind of new agey things that went on in those days. Maybe they still do, who knows. But after a couple months with him, I lost my faith. Let's put it that way. And I left him, and I wound up homeless in Venice Beach in Southern California, and really devastated because I had kind of abandoned Buddhism at that point. And then I had kind of, it was this real crisis, a real, dark night of the soul for me, living, on the street and getting friends to help me out. And I had to rebuild my life from there. And that was 1982. And 3 years later, I got sober. And during that time, I did maintain a Buddhist practice. I kind of came back to it, but there was a kind of disillusionment, I think, with all spiritual seeking at that point, because I had kind of gone into it with these distorted visions of what it was about, and so when I got sober, it became really about rebuilding my life and finding out what sort of a normal life might be. I'd been a musician, a professional musician, all my adult life, and at that point, started to look at other possibilities of, employment, and wound up going back to school, and at about 5 or 6 years sober, as my life was really coming together, and I was working on my BA, and I was starting to write fiction, it was around then, and this is fairly common, I think, around people who are sober, that I realized that the kind of initial way that I had worked the 12 steps wasn't really that fulfilling for me, and I started to step back into Buddhism in a very serious way, and that's almost 20 years ago now, because I've been sober for 25 years, and so that was kind of, when I started to think about blending the two, Buddhism and the 12 steps, started to think, because up till then, when I first came into the 12-step program, the steps, they were helpful for me. They certainly, I tried to follow them and work on them, but I didn't see how they related to Buddhism at all. I just didn't have the imagination to kind of put that together. So I kind of kept them separate in my mind. I kept doing both, but I didn't really I didn't really worry about connecting them. I just sort of said to myself, these both work, these are both helping me, and I'm just going to keep, at both of them. And meanwhile, I have to say that many people that I met, even in those early years, I would tell them about meditation and Buddhism, and I turned a lot of people on to meditation even back in those days. And so I sort of had a reputation in the circles I was in of being like the meditation guy. So
now it's interesting that you describe having this crisis of faith, and I'd like to chat about that for a minute, because I get contacted sometimes by folks who are saying, I have a problem with alcohol or some kind of addiction, and a standard 12-step program, the traditional 12-step program, isn't working for me. I'm secular. I'm not religious. And this giving myself to a higher power stuff, they're very challenged by that in particular, and some other components to it as well. And as someone who's involved in the skeptical community, I've seen some reports which indicate that 12-step programs which tout effectiveness, they're as effective as a determination with support of doing it on your own as well. So there's nothing really magical about these particular 12 steps, as long as you have some support with them. So I wanted to ask a little bit about having what your experiences were with just the Buddhism side of it, on having that as a crisis of faith, and what led you to lead away from Buddhism for a while, because I get that even completely outside the context of having any addictive problems.
Well, you're bringing up a couple things. I certainly want to address the question about the 12 steps, but just in terms of, my crisis around Buddhism was very much my own, as I said, about my own delusion about what Buddhism was, and my thinking that by going on a 3-month retreat, I was going to become enlightened, and then once I was enlightened, I'd become a rock star, and my relationship would fix itself, and I wouldn't care about drinking and using drugs anymore, and it was just the just complete delusion and magical thinking. So I can't say that I've had a real spiritual crisis around Buddhism, because for me there isn't that much faith. There certainly is faith involved in Buddhism, but it's not the kind of faith that's going to be disillusioned so much as maybe losing faith in ourselves, and maybe losing faith in the idea that in certain principles of Buddhism, like reincarnation or even enlightenment itself, and questioning that. But since Buddhism, as we practice it in the West in any case, is essentially focused around practices and insights, personal experience of insight, there's not that much to for me to feel like you're going to have a crisis of faith over.
So tell us how then, in dealing with this as a Buddhism and 12-step program, how you integrated those, because you saw some difference that warranted crafting a whole book around this particular perspective in treatment for addiction.
I'm just keep kind of thinking about the previous comment you were saying about the effectiveness, and I kind of would rather go back to that.
Sure. Let's talk about that for a while. That's fine.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to address, and in my mind.
Let's chat about the effectiveness question of 12-step programs. Tell me a bit more about that.
And I have, from time to time seen things that, they say that AA doesn't release any statistics, and I'm sure it'd be very difficult, because since AA is pretty much a anonymous program, there's no way to go in and do that. Well, even when you're talking about 12 steps, you're not really necessarily talking about AA either, which is an important distinction to make.
Right.
I don't really, I don't ordinarily even talk about Alcoholics Anonymous, not in public. Or at least not in press or radio or in my books. I talk about the 12 steps. And that's for me an important distinction, because what I'm interested in about the 12 steps is in seeing them as kind of an archetypal path, and that isn't even necessarily about addiction, but certainly is what they're designed for. But I think that my premise is that a lot of that archetypal path is shared with Buddhism and with other traditions. Maybe not every element, but that there's a lot to be that can be seen as parallel. But anyway, in terms of the effect, I certainly think that when people say that the recovery rate isn't that great through the 12 steps, I imagine that's true, and my kind of response to that is that before there was the 12 steps, there was no such thing as a recovery rate. There was, and that really the AA basically started the whole concept of the possibility of recovery, and since AA started, other people have come along with other programs, and the whole idea of treatment and treatment centers has been created, and there's a whole, obviously, industry built around this. And and as far as I know, the recovery rate across the board is poor. And I don't blame that so much on the programs as I do on the fact that addiction is an extremely difficult problem to solve.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And most people don't even want to solve their addiction. Mm-hmm. So
right.
The percentage of people that actually try to deal with their addiction is like maybe 10%. Toss out a number, but I've seen numbers similar to that even address the fact that they have a problem. So it's obvious that because really what we're talking about is attachment, right? Getting back to Buddhism. And this is the human condition, this is the human predicament that Buddhists have been addressing very directly for 2,500 years. And what's the enlightenment rate in Buddhism would be a good question, Probably even lower than the recovery rate in AA, and it's essentially the same issue, because enlightenment, presumably, if I understand it, comes from letting go profoundly on a very deep level. And that's what recovery from addiction comes from, is from letting go on a deep level. It's very hard to let go. That's the problem. I think that it's a mistake to point fingers at the people that are trying to do something. And that's not the right way for everybody. Just in the same way that following the breath isn't the right meditation for everybody. I don't, by any means, tell people the only way to get sober is to go to AA, or the only way to get over an addiction is to work the 12 steps. I don't know. What teachers teach, what Dharma teachers teach, is what worked for them.
Right.
And I think there's some real brilliance inside the 12 steps if we can look beyond the language, which admittedly is Protestant language. I was raised Catholic. Mm-hmm. So at the end of an AA meeting, if some meetings they still say the Lord's Prayer, well, they say it the way Protestants say it. They have that extra phrase at the end that we didn't say that in Catholic school. So anybody can kind of become alienated. And most of the time, when people are complaining about the program, what I see is that they don't want to do the work. And, whether you do it in AA or do it through rational recovery or life ring or do it on your own. It's work. And the problem isn't the program. The problem is the individual who's not willing to really do the difficult work of recovery.
Now, your newer book, Burning Desire, Dharma, God, and the Path of Recovery, there's, as I understand it from reading a little bit on the web about the book in particular, it talks about, there's some focus around the higher power part of it. Can you tell me a little bit more about the particular focus of that book?
Yeah. Well, that book is specifically addressing the question of what's a higher power for a Buddhist. And because since my first book came out, this has been the number one problem that people ask me about, number one question I get. And so I thought, well, let me stop having to repeat myself. Let me write it down, and people can read it. And it was really interesting for me to explore these ideas. I'm a writer. I'm not just a Dharma teacher who records their Dharma talks and compiles them into a book. I really engage in, not to disparage people who do that, but he said disparagingly. I take writing as a creative experience, as an engaged creative process. And so when I began writing each of my books, I had ideas about what I wanted to say, but both books were really journeys of discovery for me, huge discovery, and I learned a tremendous amount through writing each book. And so I had certainly a lot of ideas about what higher power from a Buddhist perspective was by the time I started my second book, but I kind of had created this challenge for myself to say the premise was the Dharma is a power. The Dharma is powerful. Practicing the Dharma is powerful. And so then I said, okay, well that means I have to take apart what I see as the kind of central elements of the Dharma and show how they are powerful and how, in the words of the 12 steps, turning your will and your life over to the care of these powers could work, and what that might mean, and how that, and would it work, So I start by talking about the power of karma. And it's very interesting to me to look at each of the aspects of the Dharma as powers. It's a shift in our perspective. To think that, the karma is a power that we have to deal with. Every action you take has a reaction. There's a cause and effect. And the principle of Buddhist morality is that there is a moral fiber or moral fabric woven into the universe that responds to our actions, whether they are moral or immoral, and that the results, are painful or pleasant depending on the morality or immorality of our actions. That's kind of I'm simplifying a bit, and I also will have to, say that obviously I'm talking about on the relative level, not on the absolute level, which takes a different, is worth exploring, but is not so much what I'm talking about. So, what this means when we say we turn our will and our lives over to the power of karma means that if our will, in Buddhist terms, is our intention, then we think of it as right intention. We try to align our intention with the Dharma. And then when we turn our lives over, that's our actions. So then we try to align our words and deeds with the Dharma and live in harmony with it, recognizing that I can do whatever I want. I have a free will, but I'm going to bear the consequences of that. And so this isn't really anything different from what any Buddhist would normally do. It's just saying that this could actually be perceived as, we could call it God. If you if you're not offended by that word, which a lot of people are. But that this is, you don't have any control over this. You can't change the law of karma. You are definitely subject to its forms and the way it works. And so when I talk about this, when I talk about these aspects, and there's much more, obviously karma is kind of my starting point, and karma is kind of the, what underpins things like the power of mindfulness. So when we act mindfully, we are doing actions that have positive karmic effects. In any case, I talk about how instead of thinking of this as a relationship where God is above us and kind of controlling us, pulling the strings, that it's much more of a relationship of a partnership. Where I do this with my hands. So, I put for the God that's sort of above us is like one hand above the other. But when it's a partnership, it's the two hands kind of parallel, and realizing that there's this relationship I have with what I can call God, but it's sort of a weird word to use for that. But a relationship I have with mindfulness, that I have with karma, that I have with loving kindness, that I have with impermanence, that I have with suffering, down the line through the Eightfold Path, that I have a relationship with concentration, I have a relationship with speech, with livelihood, and I can make choices in those relationships, but though each of those things has power and has a very powerful effect on my life depending upon the choices that I make in relation to them. I got this idea from Buddhadasa Bhikkhu. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. So, and Buddhadasa was very interested in, he did quite a bit of kind of interfaith dialogue, and there's a small book of his called Christianity and Buddhism. That's was from some lectures he gave in 1967, and he said that the Dharma is what people are talking about when they use the word God, but that when people have this idea of a God up in heaven that's magically controlling your life, that's a childish view of God, that people tell children that because children can't understand more than that, but that many people never grow beyond a childish understanding of God. But that ultimately, he says that he doesn't see there as being any, he doesn't really see some religions as theistic and some as non-theistic. He says that religions that monotheistic, the Western religions have the Dharma inside them, but it's just covered over by the outer shell of the religion. But if you penetrate it into the religion, that you'll find the Dharma in there, and that's what people are talking about when people who are, I guess I would say serious, was one thing, about the meaning of God, rather than, in our culture, God has become kind of a punching bag for progressives by sort of taking the most simplistic definition of the word God and letting it just stand for the full meaning of God. And so then you have people like Christopher Hitchens and Dawkins and talking about what is essentially a modern and certainly corrupted version of what the word God has historically meant. And I think Karen Armstrong talks about this very eloquently and much more authoritatively than I can in her book, The Case for God, or A Case for God. And she talks about how atheism is often a transitional state or stage when the old gods have lost their relevance as cultures change. And she says that even early Christians were called atheists by the so-called pagans of the time, because the people would say, well, where's your God? And they'd say, well, you can't see our God. And they'd be like, well, what are you talking about? You don't believe in God, you're an atheist. So it just, I sort of want to bring back bring God back, and frankly, if I weren't involved in the 12 steps, I wouldn't care about this issue, really. I'd be perfectly happy to be a Stephen Batchelor Buddhist, which I practically am anyway.
Yeah, I was going to say, would you pray, and you sympathize with many of the things that Stephen talks about. And
oh yeah, I certainly do, and he's been very inspiring and a great teacher for me as well. But I think that there's as people do, we're constantly kind of correcting the extremes, and the extremes of faith are being corrected, and then we go out of balance with the extremes of non-faith. When I read Sam Harris's The End of Faith, I was very excited by that book and thought it was very sharp in a lot of ways. But I do think that at times we oversimplify and this, when we talk about God, and that a lot of times people are just coming from their conditioned reactive response.
Right. They're products of their culture and their karma.
Yeah, exactly. And so just, kind of toss out these ideas, or throw out these ideas is what I mean, without seriously exploring them. As Karen Armstrong says, God is one of the most persistent ideas in the history of humankind. And there's a reason for that, not just because people want an explanation, as it's hard to put a word on one word that encompasses the vastness of life, of the Dharma, of truth. So,
yeah, it's interesting that you bring up Hitchens and Dawkins, because these are people that I've seen speak directly, being a very much a part of the atheist and the skeptic community as I am. I do see that they often take a stance that I do not, which is I think what you're speaking to, the kind of childish version of God, that they are responding to a very reactionary element, a very extreme side of a literal biblical truth. And they're responding to that. And I think they should respond to that, where they'll point out things that are just patently nonsense, that are described as physical realities. When we talk about creationism versus evolution, there is no versus. One is based on mountains of scientific, hard, repeatable evidence, and it is predictive in nature. The other is based on a religious doctrine, which is not meant to describe the natural world. And so they're responding to that, where I think we go too far often, and this has come up a few times in the podcast and in discussions on the Facebook page, that we tend to, on the atheist side, we as atheists tend to discount entire practices and entire doctrines because they are from a religious background. We're tossing out the baby with the bathwater. And when I point this out to friends who are in that same community, it says, well, we should toss it all out. I'm like, well, but that's like saying we should toss out all of science because once upon a time chemists were trying to turn lead into gold. They were wrong. And we learned from that, and we have greater understanding. But to throw out all of a particular doctrine, and I speak to them as someone who is, they are well aware, a very much out atheist with a practice that is based in Buddhist teaching. I speak to that as someone who is a Buddhist, who identifies in that way as a secular Buddhist, and I say there can be very good things we get out of these practices. And that's part of what Karen Armstrong does in her books, where I take some point with Karen is that she tends to act in a very, I would say, and bearing in mind this is from my stance as an atheist and a skeptic, a very apologist sense, in that her interpretations of what those texts say are very broad. I don't see a problem with that as long as people can practice the way they need. That's fine. I'm okay with that. Where I'm not okay is when our apologetics about a particular topic have misinterpreted them to a point of being grossly inaccurate. And sometimes I'm challenged by that. It's a discussion. Yeah. Maybe I'll ask if Karen can be on the podcast sometimes so we can discuss some of this, because I have been a fan of her works, and some of my friends have recommended this, that, or the other book, and I've read them, and some have gone, yeah, wow, that's great, you're dead on. And here I've gone, really? That's what you're trying to say here? I take exception to that. We'll have to talk about that sometime.
I mean, there's no doubt that people take ancient metaphorical teachings that come out of cultures that didn't have the knowledge, simply the information that we have now, and things that were really beautifully poetic in a lot of ways, and that there's no reason to take those things as literal teachings is almost willful ignorance, and it comes out of, I mean, I talk about fundamentalism pretty regularly in my teaching, and that it clearly comes out of fear, and I really try to understand that and sort of have compassion for people who are afraid of change and particularly afraid of the instability of reality. It's, fundamental Buddhist principle that everything is,
right.
Constantly changing, and people don't want that. None of us want that, whether Buddhist or not. The world is a scary place, and if you can hold on to some idea as absolute truth, it's very comforting, and it's very understandable that people have that need. But clearly, it creates tremendous problems, and on vast human suffering comes out of that, from warfare to oppression across the board. And as an ex-Catholic, I'm aware of just how that church has done the same thing. I'll also say that Buddhism is certainly not free of those issues. There's certainly fundamentalist Buddhism, and there's magical Buddhism, there's religious Buddhism. I mean, obviously you know all this, and at the same time, I don't know if you know Ajahn Amaro. He's one of my teachers.
Oh, yes.
And when I was writing A Burning Desire, I went to him, and because he's been a really helpful mentor for me in my writing, and he said, well, I'm trying to write a part of the book kind of addressing all the kind of gods and beings that show up in the suttas, because they're all the time.
They're part of the tradition, yeah.
Yeah, and Ajahn Amaro, who, as you know, is quite bright and quite well educated,
Yeah.
I said to him, well, do you see all this stuff as just being metaphors? These are just sort of imagery or symbolism. And he said, well, there's too many times when they show up for no symbolic purpose. No, I believe that they actually are meant to be, that these beings actually exist. And for me, something like that coming from someone like that makes me stop and just ask myself, what do I know? What do I know for sure? And so the possibility that there are forms of consciousness that I can't physically see, or that that some kind of human or superhuman consciousness exists. It's not. I can't say that I know that that's not true. I can certainly say that, well, it seems, at some point in my life I would have rejected that. But I also kind of, I think it's that for me a stance of open-mindedness, of just accepting that there are things I don't know for sure. I have opinions about that. I might have strong opinions. I mean, these days for a long time I said I don't believe in reincarnation and I don't not believe in reincarnation. I would say at this point I tend not to believe in it, but I don't even know, what it means exactly, and to start with, right? I mean, we sort of talk about it offhandedly, but really what does it mean? And so I guess my point, I guess, is pretty obvious that in terms of being open-minded, but I want to, though, finally say that none of that is pointing to the type of God that we're talking about in, as I understood it, in the Abrahamic traditions, the sort of all-powerful being who has opinions about things and moods and attitudes and all that stuff that we see in the Bible, and that Buddhism thankfully doesn't offer us something like that, but it does, some of as I say, other Buddhist teachers that I know who have beliefs that are, require the suspension of something.
I agree. I have those same experiences too with people that I know are blisteringly intelligent, and I have great and deep respect for them. And they will hold with views, we'll put it that way, that I find incomprehensible, not in terms of I don't understand or I don't viscerally understand the appeal of them. I absolutely do. But I disagree with them. And that's okay. I don't have to hold with those views. It doesn't affect my practice at all. And that's one of the nice things about our particular approach, a Buddhist approach, is that when you have two people sitting in a room meditating, whether one is doing it with an entirely faith-based reincarnation, enlightenment, and that all of that whole very religious attitude, or the person next to them who is more on my side of things, is more secular and not religious in their approach, and they're viewing this as training the mind in a very brain plasticity kind of way, that practice is indistinguishable from each other, not only in terms of just as a third party watching them, but in what's going on. They're both producing and practicing positive mental states and ways to make their lives and the lives around them better. Kevin, one of the things I wanted to ask you is, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges to recovery?
The biggest challenges to recovery in general from addiction?
Yeah.
Life. I mean, ultimately, certainly for people when they first come into recovery or they're trying to deal with an addiction, there's a range of issues from the social, finding new friends, but obviously the most difficult is just breaking the addiction itself and breaking the belief that the substance or the behavior is necessary and that you can live without it. It's really mysterious to me what allows people to get clean or to get out of an addiction. I feel less and less like I know what does that. And it is one of the challenges that I kind of, from time to time, will put to addiction professionals, just to ask them, well, what do you think you're doing? How do you think this is helping people? In terms of getting people sober, that's one of the most mysterious things in the world. The rest of it is about rebuilding a life. And so when I say life, really what I mean is that to be, let's just say, clean and sober, because I do address a lot of other addictions, including food and sex and gambling and all the rest, but just for shorthand, I'll say to stay clean and sober means that you are going to be dealing with the ongoing struggle of being a human being, and that there's no sort of book for that. And it's the same issues that anybody, to me, who's on a spiritual search is dealing with, because the recovery process, this is certainly my viewpoint, is a spiritual process. That is, we have to engage internally with our internal experience and constantly find ways of responding to that. As people stay clean and sober over the years, what tends to happen is that layers of their kind of healing happen or don't happen. People come against aspects of themselves at 5 years sober or 10 years sober that they'd never dealt with, and all of a sudden they want to drink again, or they want to use again, or they're suicidal. Plenty of people commit suicide in recovery when they feel that they can't go back to drinking, but that they can't deal with life anymore. Many addicts and alcoholics have they call them co-occurring disorders or dual diagnosis, right? Depression or anxiety conditions, some borderline, but mostly depression and anxiety, and that takes work, and therapy or whatever it takes. And so it's just it's life. That's the hardest thing. I'm sorry, it's not a
That's a big question. Well, that's it exactly, is that as you're trying to focus on one area of your life and improving conditions there, the rest of conditions, the rest of life, the rest of samsara keep coming up. They're going to roll on with or without your approval.
Yeah, and I see a lot of Buddhists who want to think that just by meditating and going on retreats, they're going to solve all the problems in their lives. And it's kind of the same thing as somebody saying that if I just go to meetings, and work this 12 steps, that's going to solve all the problems of my life. And those things work for a while, but life keeps happening, and people die, or you get sick, or you lose a job, or a relationship, and all of a sudden you don't feel like you've got the tools. You don't know what to do, how to handle that, and so it's the sense of this process of recovery as being an ongoing process, not one that gets solved, but one that is just like life, continually throwing issues at you. I think that attitude is very important, because when people think that they've arrived, then something happens and they don't know how to deal with it, because their faith is shaken. This is the crisis of faith that happens in recovery for people. They get sober and everything's going great and their life is turned around, and they think that they've figured it out, that they've got the answer. And then something changes, and then they realize, wait, that wasn't the answer. And then they question the whole process. I remember being on a retreat with Joseph Goldstein one time, and someone raised their hand and said, I figured out what I need to do in order to stay on the breath. And Joseph went, stop. Don't say it. It's going to change. And it was great. It was one of those moments that really stuck with me, that any time you think you've got the answer, whether it's to staying on the breath or whether it's to not drinking anymore, watch out.
Right, because things change.
Things change, and the most important thing is to be ready and willing to find the way of responding to the next thing that happens, or to the thing that's happening now. Obviously, not the next thing, but this thing. What do I do now? Aging has a way of, for instance, creating challenges that you never had any preparation for.
We've been speaking with author Kevin Griffin, books One Breath at a Time, Buddhism in the 12 Steps, and A Burning Desire, Dharma God and the Path of Recovery. Kevin, your website is www.kevingriffin.net. That's for folks listening, KEVINGRIFFIN.net. Kevin, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciated your insights and your time.
Thanks, Ted. It was great talking with you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on The Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.